Hello, and welcome all for this session on civilian and military collaboration in cyberspace. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to moderate this panel session. And for those of you who have been here for the week, you have heard a lot about civilian and military collaboration, or in other words, about the private and public sector collaboration. I think that's been really a key theme throughout the CyCon 23. I just wrote down a couple of statements that in fact resonates very well with today's session, such as mission assurance depends on the private sector, companies are in the front line in cyberspace. So these are just an example of a couple of statements that I heard this week and that we'll try to further unpack this morning. And to do so, it's really my honors to introduce our panelists. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists today, so I will introduce them right now. First, Mrs. Mieke Eoyang, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. Prior to that, she was the Senior Vice President for the National Security Program at the think tank Third Way. And before joining Third Way, she worked in multiple staff roles in Congress, including cybersecurity lead for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So, good morning, ma'am. Thanks for being with us. Colonel Bernd Hansen from the German Air Force. He's currently serving as the NATO Allied Command Transformation Cyberspace branch head. The Colonel Hansen has got over 30 years of active military duty, and he held several positions. And just to name a few, advisor to federal minister in Germany and branch head for the German Air Force cyberspace capability. And just also of note, his most recent deployment was in Mali as Deputy Chief of Staff Operation for the UN mission. Our next speaker, Mr. Hugues Foulon, who is currently the Executive Director for Orange Group, so one of the largest telecom companies in the world. And he's also assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer for Orange Cyber Defense. And Mr. Foulon held top-level position in Orange throughout his career. And I'd like just to mention a couple of them: Financial Control Director, Secretary of the Executive Committee, and more recently, and it's very relevant for our discussion, Director of Strategy and Cybersecurity Activity. Bonjour, Monsieur Foulon.
French.
And yeah, and last but certainly not least, Mrs. Sandra Elvin. She's currently the National Security Officer for Microsoft in Sweden, and she had more than 20 years of experience in information and cybersecurity at the strategic and operational level. She's member also of the Swedish Women's Voluntary Defense Organization and is chairing the Security Committee of the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce. So introduction being done, I think we've got a very well skilled panelists, and I look really forward to our discussion. So as I said, the CivMil topic has been already discussed throughout the week, but we wanted really to set the scene for the session today through a very short video clip that ACT's produced. So I will invite our technicians to just launch the video. It's a very short video to set the scene for our session.
Cyberspace plays a critical role in our daily lives, but also poses significant risks to military operations. Collaboration between civilians and the military is essential for improving cybersecurity and resilience. Such collaboration can take place at different levels, each with its unique advantages. At the political level, collaboration can help share strategic information, for instance on the threat landscape, allowing for better informed decisions. At the operational level, coordination can ensure that all stakeholders are aligned and can respond effectively, supporting one another. At the technical level, collaboration can help share technical information, for instance on vulnerabilities, leading to more efficient security practices. Collaboration at all levels is critical in cyberspace, and there is always room for improvement.
Yeah, so the importance of the CivMil collaboration is quite clear. It's really instrumental in the cyberspace domain. And what we'll try to do with our panelists today is to go a little bit further and to see how this can be done, how we could really foster the CivMil collaboration. And I will really ask our panelists and also the participants, when you ask questions, to keep in mind those three levels that we have, especially in the NATO cyber policy, the political, the military, and the technical level. We've got various forums and mechanisms already to implement CivMil, but there is really a need to do more and to take this collaboration to the next step. And I'd like to go right into the topic and start an initial discussion with our panelists. I will try to keep this really interactive and very quickly after the initial round of questions, open up for your comments and questions that you may have. So really be prepared. I'd like to start with you, ma'am, with the first question. The US recently released a very ambitious, I would say, strategic framework when it comes to cyber with the US National Security Strategy that we talked a little bit in day one with the US acting cyber director at the White House, but also the defense strategy, cyber strategy that your office especially was responsible for. So what I'd like to ask you is basically what's the role of CivMil in those strategic documents and especially in the strategies that you've just released, I think, last week?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. You know, I think for my office, which is responsible for producing the defense cyber strategy, we think through, within a framework of other strategic guidance in the US, how we apply that to cyberspace for the United States military. And so when we look at that strategic framework, we're looking at the national security strategy, and you see the emphasis there on allies and partners and how we've talked about what the pacing challenge is and what the acute threat is. You see the national defense strategy and how we think about integrated deterrence, which means how do we use all domains, including cyber, to achieve our national outcomes. You look also at the national cyber strategy, which talks about how we are working with the private sector, a lot of discussion there about how we try to get better secure by design, shifting liability models, but also, importantly for us in the Department of Defense, how do we disrupt malicious activity and how do we work with allies and partners? And then in our own defense cyber strategy, the application of integrated deterrence to the cyber domain, there is a big piece in there for us on disrupt. And also how do we build capacity of partners and allies in the cyber domain? And we think about partners and allies. It is very clear that our partners and allies, while we talk mostly about that in the context of our foreign partners and allies, very clearly that also involves the private sector. Mm-hmm. And I think what you've seen for the Department of Defense is a shift in the way that we do disruption with the private sector. I think some of you are familiar with our Shields Up activities at the outset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where we as the United States military and with the intelligence community were much more proactive in releasing threat information to the private sector. You see us really leaning forward in this recently so that we can provide actionable cyber intelligence to help enable the private sector to better defend the networks throughout whole of government, whole of society. And that's been a shift in the way that we've thought about things, because you've heard us in the past talk about, and we saw this play out in the wake of the earlier colonial pipeline disruption, a lot of discussion about, does the military really need to take over all these networks? And the honest truth is, we as militaries can never afford to hire and maintain the kind of workforce necessary to take on that task. I think many of us already are challenged to build and retain the kind of workforce that we need. And so we have to do this in collaboration with the private sector. And that requires us to figure out how, with the protection of sources and methods, be able to share the kind of information that is necessary to the private sector to help them enable better defenses, because they are more pervasively located, not just in the US, but as we saw with Microsoft and Starlink and others, assisting Ukraine in its fight, but also located globally to protect all kinds of civilians throughout the world. So that has been a real shift for us in how we think about deepening that civ-mil cooperation.
And if I may ask a follow-on question, so we've got those strategic documents. What about the implementation now? Could you say a few words about the next steps, basically?
Yeah, we've been working with the White House on the implementation for their strategy, and for us, there's a big part of this that involved our own production of our defense cyber strategy. There will be an implementation to follow on from that. I think that as we think about implementation, there are a number of things that we're going to have to focus on. First and foremost, people. Cyber is inherently human activity. It requires skill and training. It requires creativity. And so the investments in people is something that we really have to focus on. And how do we do that? Recognizing that so many military personnel are the target of recruiting from the private sector, that you are often trying to hire away our best people. And so how do we think about talent sharing? I think you heard Sir Håkon Hull talk about that on the first day, and how we need to rethink some of those models. So implementation will involve analysis of our own forces. It will involve some rethinking about our intelligence to ensure that we are able to support cyber operations. I think more detail than that is perhaps a bit much.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. And part of those, the strategy, especially for the CivMil, is around critical national infrastructure. Yeah. I think that's a key theme, and we have seen in Ukraine that in a context of war, those civilian critical assets might be targeted and considered as a military target, in fact. So I'd like now to turn to Mr. Foulon from Orange as a critical national infrastructure, a telecom company. How do you approach CivMil? And especially, and we've heard this from a previous speaker talking about the win-win situation. So I think collaboration needs to be both ways. So therefore, how would you expect to get some support, especially in case of a crisis, from public stakeholders or from other companies? And at the same time, what kind of support would you be ready to offer? And I'm thinking here of situational awareness, for instance, as one of the areas where the industry might provide support. So over to you to address those points.
Yes, thank you, Antoine. And I'm very pleased to be with you this morning. So just starting to maybe it's all quite obvious for you, but that the digital world is increasing, that the software is everywhere. This is the case in our networks. So most of our mobile and fixed networks all over the world are software, not anymore only hardware. So it will increase the surface of attack. And no doubt that especially with the increasing power of generative AI, the level of threat will increase either. So this is something which is very serious for us. Just a few words about Orange as a telco and Orange Cyber Defense. We have within Orange Cyber Defense, which is a fully owned affiliate of Orange, 3,000 of cyber experts all over the world, mainly located in Europe, but all over the world, even in the US, in Africa, in Asia. And we are able to work very closely with the public sector and some like police in Belgium, tax office in Sweden, of course hospitals during COVID, and Ministry of Defense in France. So we are very used to do such a kind of cooperations. And for me, the main topic, but you just mentioned it. So for me, the main topic for our company, but for the industry, I guess, is about talent. So this is the first criteria for me, the first KPI I'm looking at every morning. Are we able to attract key talents, to keep key talents, to train key talents, knowing that they won't stay for quite a long time in our company, in average 8 years, which is a little far less than at Orange Group as a telco. People are staying 30, 35, 40 years in the company. This is not anymore the case in the cyber industry. So we need to organize ourselves to cope with this issue. And we are building, not only with CivMil cooperation, but some program to share training program with other partners. We are also able to exchange talents. So we have some former officers, military officers in our company. We have also 2 officers for 3 years in our company, and we are exchanging talents with the French army for 3 years also in the other way. So this is something which is very powerful to know each other, to know how they work, and to bring additional value to both organizations. And we also try to increase in every country the number of reservists, of cyber reservists, able to help and to cooperate if there is an issue, a crisis, a war. And this is something which is very, very important for me. So talents is very the key area of try to build this civ meal. So I was not used to this word, but civ meal cooperations. Maybe 2 others areas which are very important for me. Of course, the threat intelligence, something we can cooperate and to exchange. So as a telco, we have in more than 30 countries fixed networks, mobile networks, satellite capabilities, many submarine cables. So we have a lot of important and useful information that we are able to work on and if necessary, to exchange and to cooperate about this. So this is something which is very important, and this is a key asset of Orange Cyber Defense to have such an amount of information. And our Ukrainian colleagues mentioned NotPetya and WannaCry in 2017. We were able to look at this new kind of ransomware very quickly and to protect our customers, especially in France, but also in Spain, in different European countries, very quickly because we were able to see it on our networks very, very fast. And maybe one of the last topic which is important for me, it is our ability to cooperate about innovation, how to co-innovate on different subjects, new subjects. I was just mentioning generative AI, but in France, we are cooperating on try to innovate on what we call the vehicle SOC, how we will manage cybersecurity with the new vehicles on the automotive industry, how we manage the autonomous vehicle in the future, and what is the security levels we need to have. And it is a new kind of co-innovation with public actors, which is important for me. So no doubt for me that cybersecurity is not anymore a question of only of specialists, even you are all specialists in the room, but it's a question of for managers, for officers. This is a general question. Now, it was not the case 3 to 5 years ago. Cyber risk is top 2 risk in Orange Group organization. So this is a question for the executive committee. This is a question for the CEO. This is a question for the chairman on a weekly basis. We just have a crisis yesterday evening in the West Africa. So it's a question for everyday life. And we need to cooperate, and we need to foster this civil cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And we've heard about a national perspective, critical national infrastructure perspective. I would say we've got another stakeholders, which is NATO, also in the picture. So I'd like now to turn to Colonel Hansen. So NATO, as any other organization, needs to protect its own network, but needs also to act in cyberspace, since cyberspace has been declared as an operational domain. So how, especially from your military perspective, do you see this civil collaboration supporting military operation, supporting the domain, the cyberspace domain?
Yeah, thank you, Antoine, and good morning, everybody. So before I start getting into 3 questions, basically, why is it needed and what needs to be done, and probably the 3rd question, which I will refrain from at the beginning, is how it could be done. Let me set a framework on how the military is thinking about the entire cyberspace area. So first of all, I think the interconnectivity or interconnectedness of the cyberspace poses the need for us to think about the weakest link in cyberspace when it comes to defense thinking. And secondly, from a military perspective, and that might shock a little bit the industry, we say cybersecurity, it's not a question if cybersecurity will fail, it's just a question when and to what extent. And we as a military, we need to prepare for that case. And then the question is, what is the military role in that? And there comes the question, why do we need civil cooperation? And in one sentence, it's very, very simple. The cyberspace is too big, too diverse, and too interconnected for the military instrument of power to be able to secure and to defend it as one entity. And one topic, the talent issue, has already been discussed. And from the military perspective, there are two things that we look at first, which is the critical infrastructure, which is vital to every society to keep the society running even through conflict. And as David van Wiel said, there will not be any magic handover for the military to come in if something goes southward. So we need to find a way on how we collaborate in this area. And when it comes to critical infrastructure, it will not surprise you that some critical infrastructure, which is a civilian critical infrastructure like harbors or airports or something like that, will become mission critical infrastructure for military operations. So any military commander will want to know somebody's telephone number that he can call if something happens there. So if the lights go out, I would like to call somebody from the energy sector and say, hey, you obviously have a problem. What's going on? When is the light coming back on? So these are the topics where we need to build the networks to see where we want to go. And with the interconnectedness and the rising Internet of Things, for example, and the evolving threat landscape, I think strategies to respond to this is needed. And I think we need to ask ourselves, do we do the right things? And we saw the presentation from Palo Alto yesterday, where he basically inverted a pyramid of what we did in the past and how we do it, how we should do it in the future. And those are the questions that we need to discuss when it comes to civil cooperation. So basically, the why is, we need to align our processes, we need to discuss about roles and responsibility, and we need to find a mutual support in peacetime. In summary, we need to basically build networks that can work together and are prepared for what might be coming. So in addition to the question of what needs to be done, General Badia already mentioned the term comprehensive plus approach. Comprehensive approach is a known thing for all governance or all instruments of power working together, collaborating, and the plus we added to add the industry, basically, because it's a vital actor, and that's what we want to do. And then you mentioned the 3 levels. And from our military perspective, for the technical level, we would like to see a 24/7 collaboration to enable response in speed of relevance and to basically avoid day zero vulnerability pandemics. That is which can only be prevented if all stakeholders work together. And for a military cooperation, the key idea is for the military to deliver intel-based cyber effects where they are needed. So if cybersecurity fails, the military will have to play a role, and the question is what role it is and what effect on a defensive side can the military bring to the bear. And from a NATO perspective, that's where the nations come in. What is the alliance contribution to these intel-based cyber effects that we might have there? And there again, it's about networks, it's about aligning processes, and it's about being trained, having the people ready, and the people need to know each other. As we train fighter bombers to drop bombs somewhere and tank drivers to use the tank, we need to train our cyber warriors to be ready when they are needed. So that is basically the key idea. And then the essential piece to me is the political level. Because it has been discussed all over the week, basically, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. First of all, comprehensive approach is not always an approach that was very much successful. And it can only be the politicians that make this thing successful. Instruments of power, if they want to work together, it's the politicians that make these instruments of power work together. We have been discussing here about international law and code of conduct. So, but I would go a step further. The framework, the legal framework that is needed for cyberspace to act in. So we saw a lot of crises, the bank financial crisis in 28, COVID crisis, and for some European countries now, the energy crisis after the war within the war of Ukraine. And we saw politicians being able to act and set legal framework that wasn't thought to be able. And I think for cyberspace, we know that a crisis is coming. Some militarians and some even politicians say we are in crisis. So we need to have this framework, basically, that we can work in. And from a military perspective, there's another thing that we need to discuss, and it has been touched this week as well. This is the question, basically, and that's a discussion that we would like to stipulate. Is this free thing about peace, crisis, and conflict? Does this fit for a NATO in future? Or do we need to find another solution, how we go further on that? So that might be a strategic discussion to be held on the political level. And with that, I would like to leave it here for the time being.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for the insights. And also this week we've discussed the role of the private sector in the war in Ukraine, and Microsoft was one of the industry players really helping the Ukrainian increase cyber resilience and respond to attacks. So I'd like to turn to our final panelist, Mrs. Elvin from Microsoft in Sweden. So what's your perception, especially of the challenges and roadblocks when it comes to fostering this civilian and military collaboration, and especially in light of what has been done in Ukraine? And I think since you're coming from Sweden, Sweden is implementing, the total defense concept approach, and I think it's very much relevant for the cyberspace. So maybe you can also elaborate a little bit on your Swedish perspective when it comes to this total and comprehensive approach.
Definitely. Thank you, Antoine. And so nice to be here today. So beginning with the total defense is actually not a new concept. We dismantled it somewhat in the 90s, and now we're rebuilding it again, but it's actually started already in the early 19th century. So the total defense concept is about really integrating the military defense with the civilian defense, and really recognizing the importance of the civilian society as well as industry in that, and really not just recognizing the importance, but integrating it into the whole defense planning and execution of the defense. So that's super important, both with volunteer organizations working together with, not just we have volunteers, that's great, but really integrating them, working together with them to plan for, what's the strategy, how do we work in the tactical and operational level with, same with industry, really integrating them, working together with them, sharing information and doing the work together, not just this is our strategy, please execute, but really, being part of that strategy work. So that's super important. It's been a success factor for Sweden. And also recognizing the importance of the psychological defense. How important it is to not just have the military defense, but the really psychological defense to withstand influence operations. And we work with that in Sweden since the 1950s. So super important part of that. However, if you look at the digitalization and the cyber domain, that has challenged that model as well. Because the cyber domain is very different from our traditional domains like land, sea, air, in the sense that in cyber and in space, we don't have nation borders, right? We don't have territorial control. And we have the infrastructure really, as well as kind of the borders, the lack of borders, meaning that there is no sovereignty in that sense. There is no monopoly from the government perspective on understanding what is happening in this domain, having the threat intelligence, the competence about the digital backbone, how it works, etc. And this is where us as big tech providers, we have that. And of course, we want to work with organizations such as NATO or national defense to provide this naturally, but there's no structure for it. Today, if you look at most of our defense capabilities, the defense organizations, they're very much structured around their own mission control and how they work internally, and then they source goods and services to fit into that model. And if you look at the cyber domain, it doesn't work that way. To be able to share threat intelligence, because that landscape is so rapidly developing, it's very innovative, the whole tech sector, et cetera, you need to work in an integrated fashion. You cannot just have, meetings where you share information statically. You need to work more dynamically integrated. You need to, when providing situational awareness, reports, et cetera, you need to work together, not just, okay, what information do you have to share to us? And then we go, from the NATO organization looking at, okay, so how can you use that? You need to work together, looking at the threat intelligence together to see, okay, so we have this piece of the puzzle and you have that. So how does the overall picture look like together, working really jointly? I think that's a key lesson. And part of that, one of the challenges is of course, not just the organizational structure and the processes to kind of integrate together, but also, of course, when it comes to how do we declassify information? How do we share information? That's one of the structures. So, of course, if you look at a private sector, we can sign an NDA and, then we have that kind of framework in place for sharing information. But we know with governments and defense, it's not the same, right? You have to look at the information and see whether you can declassify it or not, and that's usually a lengthy process, a time-consuming process, and we don't have that time when we talk about cyber. So we need to do something about that structure as well. So those are some of the really lessons. And I also want to touch on, I think it was you, Mieke, who said about talent and stealing talent. Us in the private industry, we have a huge challenge in Sweden, and I'm sure it's similar in other countries, that the top talents that the military recruits or even educates, they don't want to stay because of poor working climate, because of the legacy mindset. So they are brought up in a digital world. They are used to having, certain benefits, certain ways of working, certain tool sets, etc., that they don't have typically in a military environment, and that is hindering them from doing a good job. So it's not so much about salary or lack of purpose, because they're very purpose-driven, but a feeling that they cannot do a good job in their current setting. So they go to us in the private industry to get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that was a topic discussed yesterday also, the fact that the mindset needs to be addressed first, like before even the technology processes. And I don't know if Mr. Foulon from Orange, you've got anything to share also on the challenges that you are seeing in collaborating with the public sector, either when it comes to information sharing, classification. What are the roadblocks that you might encounter?
To be completely honest, we are not at this stage. It's a question of knowing each other, what are our common capabilities. It's a question of building trust. So cybersecurity, everything starting with trust. Organizations are not used to. So when you first start with the French army to discuss about exchanges of talents, it was a huge innovation for them to think that someone will go in our organization for 3 years and coming back in there. So I think we are at the beginning, given the level of threat, and I think everyone around this table is agree on that. The level of threat and the challenges we have, especially on talents, we need to cooperate, and we need to cooperate more and more. And I think we are really at the beginning of this. I truly believe that this is very important for our organization, countries, and everything. But this is the first step, and we need to increase, and that is the reason why I'm here today to share that with you. I think we have a high potential on this, and we are only at the beginning.
It's going to be a journey.
I just wanted to, I think for the US, one of the things that we've seen is that, I think we've been on a journey on cyber for quite some time, and had acknowledged cyber as a domain of military operation many years ago. That as we see the need for us to engage in the cyber domain, both for civ-mil cooperation, that it's not a situation where we can sit and wait for the time in which cyber soldiers are called, but that we have a theory of persistent engagement that requires us, as we see malicious activity taking place in the cyber domain, the day-to-day, the level, outside of a particular armed conflict, that we need to be able to address that now, because the consequences of that malicious activity can have strategic impact on a nation. They can, whether that's a critical infrastructure disruption that comes from ransomware, whether that's an attempt to interfere in a nation's sovereign decision-making process through an election, that we cannot just sit back and wait and for cyber to occur in the context of an armed conflict for us as a military to engage. And so we have to persistently engage the adversary. We have to persistently be in a position of sharing what we are seeing as threat indicators with the private sector, that is a conversation that has to be one that is much deeper than just trusted relationships between individuals in institutions, but that we have to have regular channels for that kind of communication. Because the thing that we have discovered about cyber is that you can't turn to cyber on the day the conflict starts and say, what do you have for me? These are things that need preparation far in advance of the crisis or the situation to be able to execute them timely. And so, for us, this is something where we need to think about operations all the time, both to enable effects when needed in conflict, but also just to deal with minimizing and blunting the consequences of malicious cyber activity in the competition phase.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Since we've got this persistent engagement with the adversary, we need persistent collaboration. This is what I'm hearing from you. Colonel Hansen, you want to say?
I might like to add one point here, and I couldn't agree more on what has been said about information sharing and collaboration in this piece. But I think when we talk about governmental and industry cooperation, usually it's based on a business case. Industry is, the DNA of industry is always, we have to have a business case to work together with somebody. But in the cyberspace, we need to discuss the fact that a collaboration and cooperation needs to go beyond that at a certain extent. And I think, at least from my perspective, there's no solution for that yet, but that's a question that we need to address. How, when, and how this is going to be done to go beyond just a business case where the government pays the industry to do certain things.
Yep.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, definitely this is about, defending nations, this is about defending and protecting civilian society, etc. And there's a responsibility in that. And I just want to highlight the fact that, I know that there are other companies as well, but we have a challenge in the industry, of course, with having to, we don't have tax money, right? We have to fund ourselves, but like at Microsoft, we have the government security program where we share information, so we have that in place, but we've had that for more than 20 years, and we still have that as a one-way communication. We share information, but we don't get anything back, right? There's no collaboration. There's one way, like, here is our threat intel, great, thank you. Okay, where's the collaboration in that?
Yeah.
But if I may, so you're perfectly right, but maybe it's because we are an incumbent telco with a former DNA, which is a public one initially. But we have some areas where we don't need a business case. So when we are talking about sharing, exchanging, combining, you don't need to have a business case. And when you are talking about talents, you don't need to have a business case. So you have so many areas where you can do something without any financial flows. This is possible, and this is what we are trying to promoting at the Orange Cyber Defense level. So it works.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I promise I'd like now to turn over to you, all the participants, to see if you've got any question and comments. I think we still have 15 minutes left for a discussion. I see, yep, here.
Good morning and thank you. Mieke Vollmer, BAE Systems, Cyber Threat Intelligence. This question is to you, Madam Eoyang. So I was incredibly impressed when the DoD launched its CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, in October, I think. And now a couple of months in, and already back then, I was wondering how practicable this framework is, as impressed as I am. So I'm thinking especially about commercial off-the-shelf components, which are deeply embedded, especially in cyber and satellite systems. Or if we take it from another angle, if we think about legacy technology being deeply embedded, for example, in the energy sector or in geosatellites, right? So to what, if you mind sharing your experience and your point of view, to what extent is it reasonable to assume or even reasonable to want to control all the different systems that are embedded in all those different components used along the DoD supply chain?
Yeah, this is a real challenge. And the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model that was rolled out at the end of the administration is based on the NIST framework and it's designed to try and protect controlled unclassified information, government-controlled unclassified information. So there are a couple challenges with that. Like, we are doing what we can to implement that, and I think it's in a regulatory review right now. But it is both about protecting a certain category of information from getting disclosed. So that's about information going out as opposed to malware or vulnerability that might be built in. That's a separate question on secure by design that is not addressed by CMMC. But also, to your point about there are a lot of legacy systems out there that will get developed, that were developed before CMMC was implemented. I think for many of us, militaries, private sector, et cetera, we have what we call tech debt, which is that there were systems built, deployed before we had put into place frameworks to be able to get us to more secure design. And so where that happens, we really need to focus on resilience because the point, of course, is that cybersecurity is not an if, but a when. And so there's a question of like, how do you recover from the consequences of disruption, which is about, right, vulnerability or malware coming in, not so much about information going out. And so there are places where both in the planning, exercises, workarounds, and other things, we need to come to these things with a resilience mindset. It's not about being able to say, this product is secure forever and for always. We have to be able to think, what if the product fails? Adversaries will be persistent in their attempts to try and disrupt because they have their own imperatives for that. So it's just very difficult to assume that the box that you build today will always function exactly as intended under all circumstances. So you need to be prepared for backup systems, ways of working around, regardless.
All right. Yep. Thank you.
Good day. Evgen Reus, Eesti Energia energy sector in Estonia. Quick question. First of all, great thank you for Monsieur Hugues Foulon for mentioning the very amazing formulation as the cyber reservists. I think in the current world, with the example of Ukraine, when there was such thing, because I'm Ukrainian, the IT army of Ukraine, which you've heard about, I've been a part of that. I know how it was forming, and it was forming from the people who wanted to help the country, but were not able to take the firearms, let's say, in hands. So the IT personnel, firearms is the laptop and the network. My question is, more probably to Mieke, Eoyang, and Colonel Bernd Hansen. What do you think about making a common framework that will be kind of the middle ground between the military and the civil center, the civil cooperation, in terms of the forming the cyber reservists, kind of lists? So in case of any real emergency, you know who to call, you have the framework and some protocols, and then the actions are planned, basically. Some plan of action in case of real emergency. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think for the United States, we're a large country and fortunately rich in technology talent and a very well-resourced military. So I think for us, when we think about the reserve component, we think about how to make better utilization of our formal United States military reserve components, which are people who have served in uniform, who are in a civilian status, who can be recalled to military service. And so and we have a lot of them with the National Guard. We have various National Guard units that through the State Partnership Program are paired with many countries around the room. And so for us, that would be the first place that we would go to in an emergency to be able to call up additional personnel. I think we need to do a better job of matching those skill sets against private sector capabilities and where they may have experience, in particular private sector entities that might be disrupted, so that we can have those conversations. It's also a benefit because if they are reservists in uniform, then when activated, we're able to share classified information with them, which might be difficult to share across to civilians who don't have those clearances. So I think that that's how we would think about doing that. I think while other countries might have to sort of do that civilian reserve that we saw with the Ukraine IT army, I think for the US that we're not in that place yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to me there are two sides to the same coin here. First of all, this CivMil cooperation is basically of integrating the workforces. So if being a reservist or not, that's basically what we try to do, bring everybody together to work as a team, no matter what, if in uniform or in a suit. But I think there is one key thing with reservists, and that's basically the legal framework that I touched upon. In an armed conflict, critical infrastructure might become a legitimate target for the opposing forces. Civilian companies have the rule to protect their people. So will the cyber defenders in a suit come to work in such a case? Or do we need reservists exactly for such a case? That is, to me, the question where we need to discuss cyber reservists in such a case.
One small remark on this one. The defense is not only the defense, but it's always great, especially in the cybersecurity world, that is, first is defense of the own infrastructure and own systems, but then it's defense plus some counteroffensive in order to identify who attacked your infrastructure in order to mitigate the further attacks, and plus to have the evidence for the court as well. So in these terms, just from my experience, for example, that the IT Army of Ukraine, people were not that much skilled, but they formed a pool of the hosts, let's say, of the IP addresses who could do the flooding of the Russian military resources, like DDoS attacks, which requires enormous amount of the resources. And the more resources we have, the more successful is attack. So in this vector as well, so there are people who can defend the critical infrastructure, which is under legal framework, yes, but there is also a part of the people who may be helpful not having the access to the classified data. Yeah, thank you.
I would just say on this that for the US, we would reserve the legitimacy of offensive cyber activity to the US government activities. We don't use proxies like that.
On the legal aspect, I think we've got our colleague from the CCDCOE.
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes, thank you. With regard to the legal aspect, I don't know if you agree, but probably should be clarified that legal aspect is mainly, or should be mainly, take into account from a legal perspective, but from a national perspective. So rather than the international law, that of course is something very relevant, but the lack lies on the national procedure concerning armed forces, because probably we are need to something more specific for a time of crisis, the situation other than war, in order to enlarge the so-called war powers resolution or war powers procedure that are already in place. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for the insights. We've got another question here in the back.
Hi, good morning. Lena Rieke from Leiden University, a PhD researcher working on spyware. Thank you very much to all panelists. And you've spoken today a lot, about civil-military cooperation, how to pursue a greater and deeper collaboration and partnership. But if we are pursuing an ever greater symbiosis, to me that seems like it will entail a shift of more essential state functions to the private sector. And different legal obligations and, importantly, different oversight mechanisms apply to private versus state actors. So this, might raise the risk of, for example, regulatory capture or an accountability gap. So my question would be, how do we take civ-mil cooperation not only to the next level, but ensure that this level is a desirable one in democracies in terms of oversight and accountability?
Okay, that's a good one. I don't know who want to take this question.
Yeah. I'm happy to take that on a little bit, since I've now served on both sides of the executive and legislative oversight piece of this. And I think for us, one of the things that's really important is that we do have oversight from our legislative branch, that the executive branch activities, the civ-mil cooperation is overseen by an independent branch of our government, and they have the right to question how we do things, and they do. They're very active. And so I think, but also for us, we are very conscious of our obligations under both domestic and international law, and we undertake careful legal analysis as we do anything.
All right, in the back also. Yeah.
Matthias Krempel, Germany, German Cyber Reserve. And my question goes to Monsieur Foulon and to Mrs. Elvin, because they mentioned the element, that people element of reserve. My question is reserve still an adequate expression for what we are doing and what we are aiming for? To explain, I go back tonight to my home place, where I'm not a citizen, but in Germany it says Bürger. One, and that embraces the idea of a castello around which people live. And in my town it is, we have traces from 3,000 years ago, Stone Age fortifications from Roman times, place of an old castello, medieval times, a fortified town, and it all embraced the idea that it was an integral part of a Bürger obligation to participate as part of their day-to-day life in the defense of that and the security of that place. So having said that, working now with Cyber Reserve, where it is not an issue of war and peacetime, like in the Cold War. This is where we had time to call in, and then the reserve assembled when the main forces needed enforcement. I experience that reserve, how we call it today, is not more and more integrated into the day-to-day or minute-to-minute involvement in the whole thing. In my pocket there is a phone with a lot of signal groups where we exchange information between military and civil in the allowed way. Don't worry about confidentiality issues on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis. So again, the question is, would we want to have to embrace a different concept of getting what we call reserve and military into a new way of cooperation?
Okay.
I can take that question, and thank you, sir, for that question. Very relevant. And just going back to Sweden as an example, we have the Home Guard. We don't have National Guard, but Home Guard, which is kind of this middle ground between civilian and military society, of course. And they are looking to build up just that. I'm not sure if they call it cyber reservists. I recognize that that might not be a great term here, but point is that kind of a cyber army, not just from an offensive perspective, but also defense, to ensure that they are still, maintaining the overall national objectives that we have, and not just going rogue on their own, and they're trying to figure out their own objectives, of course. But part of that is also looking at, when are we at war? I mean, there's a doctrine, like from the Cold War and going back, to say this is the threshold for declaring war, right? But with cyber, we don't have that. We have a kind of a constant state of conflict, in a sense. And in Sweden, we call that our highest general officers say, it's kind of a gray zone. And how do we manage that gray zone? We don't have, definitive answers yet, but the point is that we need to manage that gray zone, that kind of, we're not at war, but we're not at peace either. So how do we deal with that? And that is about, engaging the whole societies, training the civilian society, involving with industry to see how do we manage that? How do we ensure that we understand that we're not at peacetime? It's not normal circumstances. We need to work together closer. We're not at war yet. It's not war rules that apply, but it's not peacetime either. There's a middle ground there. So no definitive answers, but definitely recognizing the need for answers.
Okay.
So I think with that, I think we'll have to round it up in order to keep our time.
Yeah, sure. So, no, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists and also the participants for the very relevant question. The motto of our commander in ACT is really win as a team, that he keeps on repeating. And I think really cyber should very quickly, and that's already the case, become a team sport. And in that sense, CivMil is definitively a key enabler, or maybe the cornerstone for this team sport activity. So with that, again, thank you all to the panelists, and I would offer a round of applause to all of them.
Thank you.